You know that feeling when you think you're living in a quiet, normal neighborhood, and then realize it's anything but? That was me, blissfully naive, until the HOA decided my life was their personal reality show. It all started with a letter, the kind that makes your stomach twist in a way no parking ticket ever could. Violation of HOA Rule 47B, driveway alignment and aesthetic compliance. I stared at it, squinting like the words might rearrange themselves into something less ridiculous. Our driveway misaligned. A hazard. Apparently my truck's slightly crooked angle could collapse the entire street. I laughed, held it up for my wife, and said, "Well, I guess the apocalypse is parked in our driveway." She didn't laugh, not even a chuckle. She just sipped her coffee, looked at me with that calm, almost dangerous smile, and said, "Maybe they should worry about themselves instead." I thought she was joking. I was wrong, very, very wrong. That evening I noticed something odd. The neighborhood felt different, too quiet, too staged. Even the squirrels seemed to be watching. Then came the first knock at the door. I froze. Two men in black suits, clipboards in hand, standing there like they owned our lives. Not neighbors, not mailmen, officers, or at least that's what I assumed. "Good evening," one said, voice polite but rigid. "We're here about a complaint regarding your property." I stepped forward, trying to look nonchalant. "A complaint about what? My driveway." My wife appeared behind me, calm, poised, that deadly calm she has when she's about to remind the world who's boss. "I'll handle this," she said, and opened the door wider, letting them in. I stayed back, trying to suppress a grin, but secretly feeling a little like a kid hiding behind mom at a school principal's office. The officers walked around, took notes, measured angles, murmured to each other. I wanted to tell them, seriously, it's fine, just fine. But my wife didn't say a word, she simply watched them. And that's when I noticed the change in the room, the subtle shift, the way the air seemed to bend toward her authority. I had been married to a sheriff for 10 years, and somehow it hadn't registered that she is not someone you push around. Ever. After about 20 minutes of polite scrutiny, they finally left, awkwardly, whispering to each other as they backed away from our front door. I laughed, relieved. Well, that's done. My wife, still calm as a frozen lake, turned to me. "They don't know who they're dealing with," she said casually. No grin, no warning, just a quiet, deadly assurance. I didn't understand it fully at the time, but that's when the tension started to build, subtle, like the calm before a storm that rips through a neighborhood you thought you could control. The HOA had picked the wrong house, the wrong person, the wrong family. And by the end of this, they were going to find out exactly what happens when you send officers after the sheriff's wife. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining their faces, the confusion when they realized my wife wasn't just another resident and that the rules they swore would intimidate us. Well, rules mean very little when one person in the house enforces the law. Literally. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but laugh. Because if this is how it started, I had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe the officers had realized we were harmless, normal people living our lives. I was wrong, so very, very wrong. It started small, a single email from the HOA, notice, non-compliance with neighborhood standards, immediate attention required. I laughed and showed it to my wife. She read it, calmly sipped her coffee, and said, "They're poking the wrong beehive." I laughed nervously, unsure if I was being reassured or warned. Then came the subtle surveillance. At first, I thought I was imagining it, shadows moving across our yard, a car idling at the end of the street that wasn't ours. But one afternoon, as I pulled into the driveway, I saw a man in a dark jacket crouching behind a bush, clipboard in hand, pretending to take notes on, well, nothing. Honey," I whispered, pointing. My wife just looked, raised an eyebrow, and said, "They're persistent, that's good, it makes this easier." Easier? I didn't understand. But apparently watching her handle these officers would be the first lesson in humility for them. A few days later, we got another knock, and this time it was two uniformed HOA security officers. They claimed they were checking on complaints about our yard, our mailbox, and yes, the slight tilt of my truck. My stomach sank. But my wife, she opened the door like she was greeting old friends. Polite, controlled, with just the tiniest hint of "don't mess with me." They tried to intimidate her. I swear they did. They started pointing, using jargon I barely understood, like "you're out of compliance and we may escalate this matter." I wanted to step in, but my wife just nodded, listened, and stayed silent. Her eyes, the calm, unshakable stare, made the air itself tense. Then it hit me, this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. They were testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, and the funny thing, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Later that night, I tried to explain it to a friend over the phone. "It's just HOA nonsense," I said. "They're probably bluffing." My friend laughed. "Bluffing? They came to your house? Man, you're living in HOA horror story territory." But my wife wasn't laughing. She sat at the kitchen table reviewing emails and notes, calmly mapping out a strategy. I peeked over her shoulder. There were diagrams, notes on each officer, reminders about law enforcement powers. I realized then this wasn't just a game to her, it was a chess match, and I had been the pawn all along. As days passed, their visits grew bolder. One evening, I looked out the window and saw three people, clipboards in hand, crouched behind a bush, whispering to each other like spies in a cheap movie. My wife leaned next to me, smirked slightly, and whispered, "Let them come, they'll learn the hard way." And that's when I started to notice the subtle warnings in the neighborhood, neighbors avoiding eye contact, whispers about the sheriff's wife, and the way the HOA president's smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. The tension was building. It was thick, electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Little did the HOA know every move they made was being quietly observed, catalogued, and about to backfire spectacularly. I was living in suspense, watching the slow unraveling of their confidence, and honestly, it was hard not to laugh at how badly they underestimated us. By the end of that week, I realized one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be a simple warning about a tilted driveway. This was the beginning of a battle that would make the HOA regret the day they ever thought they could intimidate my wife, the county sheriff. And me, I was just trying to stay out of the line of fire, which, at this point, was getting harder every single day. I thought I had seen it all. I was wrong. It started like any other evening, quiet, peaceful, deceptively peaceful. Then came the knock at the door, three officers, not friendly, not polite. They looked like they were ready for a battle over a mailbox. My stomach sank. "Good evening," the tallest one said, clipboard in hand, eyes darting around our porch like we were hiding contraband. "We're here regarding repeated HOA violations at this property." I swallowed hard. Violations. Again, over the driveway, over a mailbox. Maybe even my taste in garden gnomes. I glanced at my wife, who was standing there calmly, holding a cup of tea like she was about to host a Sunday brunch. "Please," she said, voice soft but firm, "come in, let's discuss this." I nearly choked. Did she just invite them in? The officers hesitated. I could see it in their eyes, the confusion, the subtle shift in energy. They were used to residents cowering, apologizing, panicking, not this calm, collected presence. My wife smiled politely, gesturing toward the living room, and I swear the air itself seemed to bend toward her authority. They started their usual spiel, pointing at minor cracks, tilts, and non-compliant structures. I tried to step in, stammering something about it being a minor issue, but my wife cut me off with a single look. One look, and suddenly I remembered I was just a spectator in this scene. Then it happened. The first officer hesitated, looking like he had just realized he'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood. The second officer shuffled awkwardly, glancing between my wife and the clipboard. And the third, he actually backed up a step like someone had flicked a switch in his brain. "Ma'am," the tallest one said cautiously, "we need to ensure compliance with HOA regulations." My wife tilted her head slightly, smiled, and replied casually, "You're speaking to the county sheriff." The room froze. I swear I could hear the clipboards dropping in slow motion. Their polite confidence vanished in an instant, replaced by wide-eyed panic. They had no idea at all. "Sheriff," stammered one, voice shaking like a leaf in a storm. "Yes," she said, still calm, still smiling. "And if there are violations, we can discuss them at my office." I wanted to laugh, I almost did. But there was something else, a tense, cinematic moment where I realized these people had crossed the line. The HOA thought they could intimidate us, harass us, poke at us like insects on a windshield. They had no clue what was coming. The officers fumbled for words, their authority evaporating faster than ice on a summer sidewalk. They mumbled apologies, tried to backtrack, and suddenly the conversation had flipped entirely. We weren't the ones being investigated, they were. And I just stood there watching the perfect storm unfold. My wife handled it with calm precision, polite, professional, yet terrifyingly firm. I couldn't help but admire her and secretly laugh at how badly these officers misjudged us. By the time they left, muttering excuses and shuffling down the driveway, I knew one thing for certain. The HOA had no idea what they'd unleashed. They had poked the wrong house, the wrong family, and from here on, the rules weren't going to apply to them anymore. That night, as we sat on the porch, I asked her quietly, "Do you think they'll come back?" She smiled, a tiny glint of mischief in her eyes. "Oh, they will, but they'll learn the hard way eventually." And just like that, I realized this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a war, and we were fully prepared. It didn't take long for word to get around the neighborhood. One minute, the HOA officers were strutting around like they owned the place. The next, they were whispering to each other, glancing nervously at our house, and avoiding eye contact like guilty kids in a candy shop. I noticed it first at the community meeting. You know, those dreadful HOA gatherings where everyone pretends to care about the exact number of inches your mailbox sticks out. The president, let's call her Karen because of course was packing back and forth like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Every time my wife entered the room, the air shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter froze. Even the coffee machine seemed to hiss in fear. She didn't say a word at first, just smiled politely at everyone, nodded as people babbled complaints about minor infractions and took a seat, and then the whispers began. Is she really? I heard she's… Oh no, not her. I nearly choked on my own iced tea. I tried to whisper to her, they're talking about you. She just raised an eyebrow and whispered back, let them, it'll be entertaining. Karen attempted to regain control. She rattled off a list of violations as if reciting scripture, but something was happening. Her words were hitting empty air. People weren't listening. They were watching my wife. And slowly, panic started replacing her authority. One of the HOA officers, the one who had tried to intimidate us at the door, raised his hand to speak. The room froze. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He looked around, lost, unsure if this was a normal meeting or a hostage negotiation. Excuse me, Karen finally said, her voice tight. Are you going to? She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence because she just knew she had no leverage anymore. That's when it hit me. The HOA finally realized the stakes. The officers, the president, even the board members, they were playing checkers while my wife was playing chess. And in her world, there were no pawns. Everyone knew the sheriff could bend the rules, but enforce them, that was terrifying. Humor and panic collided in a strange way. People were muttering apologies, offering nervous smiles, and I could almost see the mental gymnastics trying to justify their previous behavior. Meanwhile, I was sitting there, laughing quietly to myself, because this was the exact outcome my wife had predicted. After the meeting, as we walked out, I whispered, "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" She smirked. Forgive, maybe. Respect, definitely. Fear, absolutely. Back home, I noticed a subtle but significant change. Neighbors stopped peeking over fences, security patrols vanished, and Karen's emails became polite, cautiously polite, but there was still tension, a lingering dread that they hadn't yet learned the full lesson. That night, I was lying in bed, thinking about how a simple HOA dispute had escalated into this surreal standoff. It was like living in a sitcom directed by a thriller director, and I realized something important. The HOA had no idea what was coming next. Little hints started appearing around the neighborhood, faintly ominous signs that my wife had begun quietly setting the stage. The way she casually noted officer patterns, the timing of her evening walks, even her calm, measured tone when she answered emails, it all screamed preparation. And by the looks on some of the board members' faces, they had begun to suspect, but they didn't know how serious we were. By the end of the week, I realized it was no longer a matter of minor infractions. This had turned into a showdown. Every HOA visit, every friendly inquiry, every threat, it was now a high-stakes game. And my wife, she was in full control. Calm, collected, and utterly terrifying to anyone who tried to underestimate her. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, one thought ran through my mind. If this is what the HOA realized before the storm fully hit, I couldn't wait to see their faces when the real confrontation came. The calm before the storm had passed. By now, the HOA had learned painfully slowly that they weren't dealing with a regular family. They were poking a hornet's nest without realizing it, and hornets don't just sting, they dismantle your entire operation if you provoke them enough. My wife, as always, was calm, too calm, really. She spent the week quietly observing patterns, the comings and goings of the HOA officers, their patrol schedules, the timing of emails and friendly visits. She wasn't planning revenge, not really. She was planning order, and I was along for the ride, trying not to get crushed under the weight of her quiet brilliance. One evening, as we sat on the porch with our drinks, she looked at me and said casually, "They're predictable, too predictable." I squinted, who? The HOA and their little security team. Every move they make is sloppy, obvious, and desperate. I laughed nervously. You mean like a bad TV show? Exactly like a bad TV show, she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. Except this time the script is mine and the writers, they don't even know I exist. I tried to imagine the absurdity of the situation. The neighborhood board sending officers to intimidate my wife, not realizing that the county sheriff lived in that very house. It was cinematic, comedic, terrifying, and somehow all of it felt like it was spiraling toward something incredible. Over the next few days, subtle changes started. The HOA started sending more friendly reminders. trying to assert authority with carefully worded emails. But my wife, always polite, always professional, responded with small, firm notes, nothing aggressive, nothing threatening, just reminders that she was the law and that violations could be discussed officially. The officers themselves were starting to crack. One of them accidentally left a clipboard at the end of the driveway. I swear it was almost symbolic, and my wife didn't even move. She simply noted it, filed it mentally, and smiled. Meanwhile, I was panicking silently, imagining the lawsuits and fines we might avoid if she could somehow just handle this without me interfering. Neighbors started noticing the tension too. People whispered behind curtains, watched from windows, tried to snoop without being seen. They didn't know it, but every glance, every half-hidden conversation was cataloged by my wife. She knew who was loyal, who was curious, and who was about to witness a train wreck of epic proportions. I started to feel like a supporting character in someone else's thriller. Every day, I'd glance at the driveway, the yard, the mailbox, all the supposedly illegal things, and marvel at how calm she remained while the HOA teetered on the edge of chaos. And then one night, she turned to me with that dead serious look and whispered, "Tomorrow, they'll send someone again. This time, I want to make sure they understand the rules aren't optional. Not here, not ever." My heart raced. Rules optional or show them who's boss? Both, she said, smiling faintly. They'll see and they'll regret underestimating us. At that moment, I realized the stakes had changed completely. This wasn't just about a mailbox or a crooked driveway anymore. It was about control, authority, and pride. And the HOA, they had unwittingly walked into a scenario where they had no idea who they were dealing with. I couldn't wait for the showdown, but at the same time, I was terrified. Because watching my wife in action is beautiful and terrifying. Every movement, every word, every subtle glance radiates power, and I knew the HOA wasn't ready for that kind of power. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had shifted. Silence lingered where there had been chatter. Emails went unanswered. Officers approached cautiously as if afraid the ground itself might bite them. And in our house, we were calm, sipping coffee on the porch, waiting for the next move. The stage was set, the players were ready. And the audience, well, the HOA had no idea the show was about to begin. The knock on the door that evening wasn't subtle. Not anymore. 3 officers, clearly sent by the HOA, stood there, clipboards in hand, looking far too serious for what should have been a minor neighborhood dispute. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisted. And my wife, she opened the door as if she were greeting guests for tea. "Good evening," one officer said, voice stiff. "We're here regarding ongoing violations." I wanted to step in, but my wife gave me that look, the one that says sit down and watch, so I did. The officers launched into their usual spiel, tilts, cracks, aesthetics, mailbox angles. I tried not to laugh as they spoke like they were reciting the Dead Sea Scrolls of HOA rules. My wife listened patiently, smiling politely, nodding slightly. But then she said something that made the entire atmosphere shift. "You do realize," she said softly, deliberately, "that I'm the county sheriff." The room froze, time slowed, one officer's jaw literally dropped. The tallest officer nearly toppled over his clipboard. The third one looked like he had just seen a ghost wearing a badge. "Wait, what?" stammered one, eyes wide. "Sheriff as in law enforcement." "Yes," she said, calmly stepping aside, letting the words hang like a thunderclap. "And if there are any violations, we can discuss them officially, at my office." The officers shuffled, unsure what to do. They had come here to intimidate a resident. Instead, they had walked into a living nightmare. The polite authority they carried out on paper meant nothing in front of someone who could enforce the law with a flick of her wrist. One officer started muttering something about procedural rules. My wife tilted her head and said, "Procedural rules? You're on my property discussing HOA complaints. I think the procedure is clear." I couldn't help it, I had to suppress a laugh. The scene was cinematic. The officers, trained to be intimidating, suddenly reduced to bumbling tourists in a horror film. Their confidence evaporated in seconds, replaced by a mix of fear and awe. Karen, the HOA president, had arrived mid-chaos, expecting to assert control. She opened her mouth to scold, but my wife didn't even glance at her. Karen froze. Even she had underestimated the situation. The officers tried to regain composure, cleared their throats, and mumbled half-hearted apologies. One even tripped slightly over the welcome mat. Poetic justice, I swear. My wife remained calm, professional, and polite, a terrifying combination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they retreated. The door closed behind them with a nervous click. Silence fell over the porch. I turned to my wife, half laughing, half in disbelief. "Wow, that was incredible," I said. She smiled faintly. They'll think twice before coming back, or at least I hope they do. I realized then that this was more than just a victory. It was a warning, a statement, and a reminder. The HOA had poked the wrong house, the wrong family, and I had front row seats to every moment. Over the next few days, the neighborhood felt different. Officers avoided our street. Karen's emails became excessively polite. Even the neighbors who had previously whispered and gossiped now gave us wide berth. Subtle signs of respect or fear were everywhere. And yet I knew it wasn't over. The HOA was stubborn, desperate, and petty. They would try again, maybe even escalate, but they didn't know the rules had changed. The game was no longer theirs, it was ours. As I watched my wife organize her notes, making sure every detail was accounted for, I couldn't stop thinking, this isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It's a lesson. A lesson in underestimating people, in authority and respect. And the HOA, they were about to learn it the hard way. That night, as we sipped coffee on the porch, I whispered, "Do you think they'll ever recover?" She looked at me, eyes calm but deadly serious. "Recover? No, they'll think they can, but they'll remember this lesson forever." And with that, I realized the real storm had only just begun. By the next morning, the neighborhood had changed. You could almost feel it in the air, a mix of awkward tension, whispered gossip, and barely disguised fear. People avoided our street like it was a minefield. Even the mailman seemed hesitant, lingering at the end of the driveway like he wasn't sure he wanted to deliver anything. And then came the HOA calls. First emails, polite, overly polite, nervous. Then phone calls, fumbling, apologetic, the kind of calls that made you want to lean back in your chair and laugh while sipping coffee. Hello, we wanted to apologize. Yeah, sure. Apologize to the sheriff's wife for trying to intimidate her. Better late than never, I guess. Karen, the president, was next. She came to our door, flustered, trying to smile, trying to act confident. My wife answered, calm and collected as always, and listened politely while Karen stammered through her speech about misunderstandings and neighborhood harmony. Harmony? The only harmony around here was that I didn't get arrested for laughing too loudly at the sheer absurdity of it all. I watched as Karen's cheeks turned pink, her words tumbled over themselves, and I realized something. The tide had turned completely. The HOA officers who had tried to intimidate us vanished from the neighborhood. No more patrols, no more random visits. The fear in their eyes lingered in the stories people told at the grocery store and in hushed whispers over backyard fences. Everyone had learned, one way or another, that this wasn't a normal household. Neighbors started showing up at our porch, curious, polite, even a little nervous. "So, are you really the sheriff?" one asked, voice barely above a whisper. My wife smiled, nodded slightly, and answered in her usual calm, professional tone. "Yes, and if anyone has questions about rules or violations, I'm happy to answer them officially." I couldn't help but chuckle. Watching the neighborhood scramble to adjust to reality was like watching dominoes fall, slow, dramatic, satisfying, and the best part, Karen's desperate attempts to regain control were spectacularly failing. Every email, every meeting, every whispered threat now bounced off invisible walls. They had no leverage, no authority, and worst of all, no clue how to regain it. Even the minor violations, the crooked mailbox, the slightly tilted driveway, became a running joke among neighbors. People would whisper, laugh quietly, and shake their heads in disbelief at the audacity of the HOA to think they could intimidate a sheriff's family. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had settled into an uneasy, hilarious peace. Karen stopped showing up at our door, the officers stopped lurking. And my wife and I, sipped our coffee on the porch, quietly enjoying the quiet victory, knowing full well that every person in the HOA now second-guessed their every decision. But my wife wasn't done, not exactly. She had made her point. The HOA had learned a lesson in humility, respect, and fear. Subtle reminders lingered just in case anyone forgot who was in charge here. She maintained calm authority without ever raising her voice, letting the HOA know that power could be quiet but devastating. And I had the best seat in the house. I watched the chaos settle, the fear fade, and the respect grow. Every glance from a neighbor, every sheepish nod from an officer, every awkward attempt at a smile from Karen, it was like living in a slow-motion comedy drama. As we sat there that evening, my wife glanced at me and said softly, "They'll remember this for a long time. And maybe next time they'll think twice before trying to intimidate someone in my house." I nodded. "Think twice, they'll probably run for the hills." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe they'll just send someone else and we'll do it all over again. But the rules, they're clear now, not optional, not ever." And as the sun set over our quiet street, I realized something important. The HOA had underestimated us, underestimated her, and underestimated the power of calm authority. The battle wasn't just one, it was a statement. A statement that in this neighborhood some people play by the rules and some enforce them. By the time the dust settled, the neighborhood was quieter. Not peaceful, quiet in that uneasy, respectful way that happens when everyone knows someone could literally enforce the rules, and not in a polite HOA kind of way. Karen, our HOA president, had stopped showing up at our door. Her emails went from passive-aggressive to polite to nearly formal legalese. I could only imagine her sitting at her desk, rereading them, muttering under her breath, "How did this happen? How did a mailbox and driveway become this?" The officers gone completely. It was as if they had disappeared off the map. We catch glimpses of them driving past occasionally, but they kept their distance. My wife's reputation had preceded her. Even casual neighbors would stop by the porch whispering, "So you are the sheriff?" and she'd smile calmly, letting them feel the weight of that quiet authority. I still laughed at the absurdity of it all. Our biggest neighborhood threat, the HOA, had been dismantled not by lawsuits, not by confrontation, but by sheer presence. My wife didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need threats. She simply existed in her full, professional, intimidating glory, and everyone had noticed. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The driveway remained slightly tilted, the mailbox leaned at its natural angle, and my truck was still parked crookedly. No one dared mention it, not a single word. I couldn't stop grinning every time I walked past. We had won without a single fight, at least not the kind that required a court. Even the neighbors had learned their lesson. Subtle nods, awkward smiles, and polite conversations replaced whispers and gossip. People now treated us with the respect we deserved, or perhaps the fear they couldn't hide. The power of calm, professional authority is not to be underestimated, I realized. One evening, as my wife and I sat on the porch sipping our drinks, I asked her, "So, do you think the HOA will ever try anything again?" She laughed softly, a quiet, dangerous laugh that made me shiver. "Maybe some people never learn, but if they do, we'll be ready, and next time they'll remember that the rules are not optional. Not here, not ever." And that, I realized, was the real lesson. The HOA had underestimated us. They had assumed that authority came only from titles and letters, from threats and notices. They forgot that true authority is calm, professional, and absolute, and when it's paired with experience and intellect, well, that's a force even the most arrogant HOA can't overcome. The final act came quietly. Karen attempted one last, friendly visit to smooth things over. My wife answered the door with the same calm, professional demeanor, listened patiently, and offered a gentle reminder that we were always open to discussion at her office where she enforced the law. Karen left, flustered, muttering apologies, her authority evaporated completely. I leaned back, watching the neighborhood lights flicker on. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and awe, watching my wife handle the entire situation with humor, grace, and quiet terror. For anyone who dared oppose her had been incredible. She didn't need to yell, she didn't need drama, she just was, and that was enough. Life in the neighborhood returned to a new normal. Officers kept their distance. HOA meetings continued, but our street was never mentioned again. And as for me, I finally realized something important. Living next to a sheriff isn't just safe, it's entertaining, educational, and in some ways life-changing. As the sun set, I whispered to her, "Next time the HOA comes after us." She smiled faintly, a glint of mischief in her eye. "They'll think twice." And that, my friends, was the end of our little HOA nightmare, at least for now. Lessons were learned, boundaries were enforced, and one simple mailbox and driveway had become the stuff of neighborhood legend. Because in this house, the rules aren't suggestions, and the sheriff, she always gets her way. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.